Drifting North is a climate road trip. It's a personal journey through the past, the present, and the future, not just of Scotland, but also of the world at large, looking at how we got into the climate crisis and potentially how we get out of it. I published my first book 9 years ago now, and the plan was to follow that up fairly swiftly with another book. And then what happened was, as it's kind of made clear in Drifting North, I was in a road accident, and it completely changed my life and changed my career. And as I was recovering, I realized that I couldn't write the book I wanted to write, which was kind of a big world spanning climate change book. And so I thought to myself, well, I want to write this story, and I need to write this story because I need to prove to myself that I can still do this. I need to give myself something to work towards as I recovered. And so I set out around Scotland, based on things that had already happened to me and based on things that I already knew, and then some new locations as well, to try and tell the story of climate change through the prism of the Scottish landscape. And that involved interviewing hundreds of people directly and indirectly. Some were informal conversations, some were big sit-down interviews. I was driving. I think total I drove about 10,000 miles, on the trip, and it was a chance for me to really kind of get to know the country, but also to get to know myself again. And I think what comes across clearly in the book is that as the book goes on, my encounters with these different situations, and particularly being in the landscape, helps me to kind of get back in contact with where I was going. And this becomes a kind of extended way to explore how we all collectively navigate the climate crisis. I've been traveling my whole life, and I think that I come to realize that in some ways I'm happier on the road than sat at a university desk, with my feet against the skirting boards. I decided to become a journalist when I was in my teens, really, and started doing journalism when I was 17 or 18. And then I worked as a foreign correspondent for a number of years. Kind of ended up doing a PhD by accident, didn't think any more about it. And then I'd come back to Scotland from living in Scandinavia to do a little research project. And it wasn't long after that that my accident happened. And I was diagnosed with something called post-concussion syndrome, which is kind of a long-term brain condition where you experience the effects of concussion for, not just a few months, but in my case, several years afterwards. And it's kind of like being drunk every day when you wake up, and it can take you 3 or 4 hours to get going. There's days when you have brain fog, days when you have dissociation, all kinds of things. And then I got COVID, and COVID really stopped my recovery from progressing. And so the desire to get out and about and the desire to go on the road is really, really strong, because I'd spent so long lying in rooms. I'd spent so long, in hospital waiting rooms, lying at home in the dark, with my eyes closed, trying not to overstimulate my brain. As soon as I felt well enough, I felt this really strong drive to get out and, get out of the classroom, get out of my house and go to these places, which some of which are very special to me. I mean, there's places I go in the book that I first went to as a child, for example, and now revisiting them with the kind of 30 years down the line, it's really quite a strong emotional connection you've got there. But also, I got to go to some new places. So I got to go to some really cool places like the Doomray nuclear reactor, an offshore wind farm, an abandoned oil rig, some amazing stuff like rewilded forests, and some really kind of unexpected little side quests as well. So going off to things like oil refineries, hanging around with climate protesters. It was really, really diverse. And what I was trying to do was capture, I guess, a moment in time when we are on the edge and where we're kind of trying to work out what happens next, but to do this in a way that I felt comfortable with. Now, I'm both a writer and a journalist by trade and an academic, and I think it's quite unusual to have that combination. One of the things I feel quite strongly is that writing for the public and storytelling is an important part of what we call public sociology. So many people, especially when I was writing this book, I'd say, "Oh, I'm at the University of Glasgow," and I would turn up and they would expect me to kind of have a clipboard and a list of things to tick off. And actually, when you're just looking at everyday life and speaking to people about what they consider to be unremarkable things, that's when you find the real truths. And for me, there's all the spectacular stuff, all the floods, all the storms, all the heat waves, but it's the little bits of everyday life, the kind of banal details that really give you hope because you see people living. And I think learning to live is a really important part of negotiating climate change. I think the problem with journalism increasingly, as it's increasingly poorly funded and it's harder and harder to get support for good, substantial work, is that I used to find, especially when I was working as a foreign correspondent around Northern Europe and elsewhere, you would go somewhere and all that would be of interest would be the top line, and you would have all these encounters with people, you would have all of these experiences, and you think, God, how do I translate this for an audience who are going to read 8 to 1,200 words from me? And I think for me, the attractiveness of writing a book like this one was the ability to do that, to take some of those sort of textures and sensations almost and put them into a more tangible form of writing than just having something posted on a news website. I write a little bit in the book about kind of my early journalistic career and things like going to cover Barack Obama when everyone was full of hope and everyone was kind of really believed that the world was kind of getting better, and how journalism can be really, really great. But what it doesn't do well, and I think it does increasingly less well, it doesn't communicate the nuance and the complexity of everyday life. It gives us very simple stories. And climate change isn't a simple story, and everyday life isn't a simple story. Um, and that's also why I wanted to explore my own personal story, because I think it helps to unpack some of these ideas a bit better. The great tragedy now is there are very few places in the UK that are willing to engage, sort of long form quality journalism. If you wanted to write something that's 4 or 5 thousand words long, it's very hard to get it published anywhere at the moment, and that's a real loss socially. I think hopefully one of the things I kind of also get across in the book is the idea that writing is has its own worth, right? So going out and finding these stories, telling them, has a worth beyond the monetary. But also, even if nobody reads it now, if somebody picks it up in 20 years' time, 30 years' time, it becomes an artifact. And, to borrow a perspective from university, a lot of the stuff we do can't be measured in short-term cycles. It might well be that somebody picks up something that I've done now in 100 years and it proves really important to whatever they're doing. So you have this responsibility to witness and document as well. And we need to carry on doing that. I think as soon as you stop looking, you're doing yourself a disservice and you're doing society a disservice as well. I think that Scotland's kind of unique because it's been at the centre of several energy transitions. And one of the characters that pops up in the book is actually my colleague Ewan, as a economic historian of energy, and we've had lots of conversations about why Scotland is so special. I think everyone likes to claim that the place they come from is special. And Scotland is my adopted home, um, and I think that as you read the landscape, you begin to see in it a history that not everybody sees. So Scotland was one of the first large-scale coal fields in the world. It was a centre of empire. It created, in many ways, the carbon economy as we have it. And then after that, it became one of the world's leading oil-producing nations, right? And then after that, it's now become one of the world's most productive nations for renewable energy, even though that has not necessarily had the social transformation that we might want to see from it. So it's really a lab. And, this book is partly a kind of love letter to Scotland, but it's also an attempt to take a step back and say, if this is a laboratory for the future, are we doing the right things and what can we change? And there's lots that coming out of that. I think Scotland likes to tell a good news story about itself, and compared to England, sometimes I think there's a bit of a tendency to think, oh, it's a better version. In my first book, I'd written quite a lot about kind of Sweden and how people project their ideas onto Sweden, and people do the same with Scotland. Equally, it goes in both directions, and I think there's a lot that Scotland could learn from elsewhere. And when it comes to climate change, Scotland is not feeling the worst effects of climate change, but then we also, I think, have a responsibility there in terms of how we take what we can do to the world. And in the book, I also visit places like southern Spain after a climate disaster, and there's talk about heat waves. visiting Japan, sort of extreme summer heat where people can't go outside. I've also done professional work in places like India, and there's a bit of work in there from America as well. And you really see how diverse the impacts are, but also the common threads. And I think what is really important is that when you try and tell the story of a place, you understand that every place has its story, right? Every place has a multitude of real lives and events which are individual, but they're all part of this big global story. And the reason that I think that storytelling is important in navigating the climate crisis is not just to persuade people that climate change is real or persuade them to do things, but it's about making people understand that the world they live in is connected to other parts of the world that are very far away, and that the only way we can solve this collective problem is by understanding how our stories fit together. I think there were. I think that one of the things that you see as you go around Scotland and the UK as a whole now is the kind of disintegration of social infrastructure. And when I was ill, I noticed two things. One, that the NHS isn't really there in the way that you think it is until something really bad happens. Most of us just go to the GP. We don't necessarily contemplate that we're going to get like a brain injury or get cancer or whatever. And that as soon as that you realise that's not there, it kind of makes you look differently at so many other things. What really, really came across for me is that we need really strong public institutions to fight climate change. And there's a lot of people out there doing good stuff. People working in charities, people working for the government on tiny budgets. They all need more help, right? And it's not just a question of incentivizing people to change their behavior or whatever. In terms of my recovery, I started to think quite a lot about how, climate change is a sickness in many ways. There's a bit in the book where I talk about the kind of overlap between brain injury and climate change, which is both of which are you have energy going to the wrong places, and it messes up the systems of response that allow you to self-regulate. So when you get a brain injury, you are unable to do things that you would usually do automatically, like regulate your temperature, for example. And climate change is the same. What we have is a kind of toxic feedback loop, which we can stop, but the further down the road we go, the harder it is. The other thing that really hit home for me was that the space for recovery is really important. If anybody has any kind of long-term illness, one of the best things you can do for them is to take off the stresses and give them the time and the space. And I was, when I first became ill, I didn't have any savings really, so I was looking at surviving on £90 a week in statutory sick pay, which means I wouldn't have been able to pay my mortgage, I wouldn't have been able to do loads of other things. And this is a reality faced by people all the time. Those strong institutions that allow people to take that bit of space are also the kind of thing that we need to do to solve climate change. We need to have an understanding that these aren't cost savings when we cut funding. These are public investments, right? The same way that reaching net zero is not too expensive to do, right? It's an investment in our collective futures and in our collective well-being. But also, there's loads of other overlaps between climate change and how we see our daily lives. So the way we structure the economy has big impacts on climate change. And the UK is very much, and Scotland is very much obsessed with productivity and growth. And these are important things in many ways. But what you cannot do is fixate on this. It almost becomes pathological. And you need to be prepared to take a step back and ask what I'm actually trying to do here. And for us to navigate the next 100 years collectively, globally, we all need to say, well, actually, is this the best thing for us? So we can see it as a type of, I would almost say, collective psychosis, actually, whereby our inability to deal with climate change is because we are so stuck in the idea of things we should be doing rather than the things that we need to do. I think Scotland is interesting because Scotland was very happy to have the oil industry, right? The way that Scotland embraced the oil industry was based on inviting big international companies in to develop it and then creating lots of jobs, which it did. The problem is now is the oil industry is declining, it's on its way out. North Sea productivity has been declining for decades now. And those big companies have not been honest with either the general public or the people who work for them about what the implications of that are. There's huge costs associated with decommissioning. also in terms of shifting to a new economy, it's just stuff we should have done 20 years ago. And I think that one of the things that is really interesting about the way that I've tried to explore this issue is, there's some stats in the book about, energy production and things like that. But it's really, when you sit down with people, in the pub or in their homes sometimes, and say, well, what does your daily life look like? How are we negotiating this? What does a good job look like for you? What would you like your children to do? And a lot of them, have very, very similar expectations, which is that they would like to have well-paid middle-class jobs, but they're not wedded to doing it in oil necessarily. They're not wedded to doing it in gas. So the challenge is to make sure that we can have that economic stability. For me, I guess, as somebody who's kind of operating at the apex of anthropology and journalism, locating those stories and then asking what those stories can do is really, really important. We're beginning to talk more and more about what we call transition narratives. We see there's a huge appetite for social solidarity around climate change as well, because people who, we see this most of all in somewhere like Shetland, which did very well from the oil industry for a period. There, people are now coping with things like, their swimming pools are closing, the doctor isn't as available as they used to be, their subsidies for their public transport are starting to creak a little bit. These are all things that people notice. And then the challenge there is to say, okay, well, how do we solve this? And how do we solve this in a way that helps us to move to the next chapter in energy development in the economy? And that's something that applies wherever you are, right? So when it comes to uh, showing what happens next, Scotland as an early adopter can learn from itself. But when you look at all these countries, particularly developing countries that have still got big fossil sectors, there is a lesson there as well, because that will drop off a cliff at some point, and if they're not ready, it will hurt them. I think there's a very strong moral and emotional component to the book that really talks about what you might call kind of the life worlds of place. So really, really trying to get to the heart of what it means to be part of one of these communities, and what it means to maybe be to believe in something that then turns out to be damaging, like the oil industry. We've seen a huge shift in the last couple of years in the North Sea, in particular, with people who are ostensibly kind of fossil workers, pro oil, who've suddenly found that they've had the rug pulled from under their feet. There's one of the most interesting bits of the book for me is I shadow a protest by some climate change protests at Scotland's biggest oil refinery, and they're demanding that the oil refinery close because of its climate impact. What then happens about a year later, which I come back to at the end of the book, is that there is the refinery is closed, but it's closed because the multinational company that owns it isn't making enough money and wants to pull out. All of these workers who were kind of mobilized and used as a straw man argument as to why we need to keep refining fossil fuels in Scotland, they were completely disposable, as it turns out. And so these people have suddenly shifted in many ways from being, vocally pro fossil fuel and saying, well, we need this, to actually having a lot of solidarity with climate protesters. And some of the climate protesters who were trying to shut down the plant were also present a year later at the march to protect the jobs of the workers. And this is what we talk about as the just transition, right? We know that multinational companies are not very loyal, and they will often make some noise about community benefit, but they will pull out as soon as they get better offer elsewhere. And we've seen this in Scotland already. And so I think the lesson is you can never trust, the big energy multinationals. And this is true even for renewables. Like if one of the big energy companies comes in and says, okay, well, we want to build this wind farm or, this nuclear power station, this is now happening, you've got to be really, really skeptical about what it is that they need from you and what they're going to get out of it and what you get out of it. Because Scotland has been had, several times now, where its natural resources have essentially been taken from it, and it's got very little back in the long term. I found a lot of grounds for optimism because I think climate change is horrific. Right? Climate change is awful in every possible way. And here in Britain, we see only the very, very sort of top edge of that. What I found on the road was going through a series of kind of emotional gates where I was digesting information, and sometimes I was speaking to people who knew less than me about the facts of climate change, Sometimes you speak to people and hear a lot more. And what you find is people are often living in kind of their little, I wouldn't say silos, but they're living in their own little lives and trying to get on with their lives. A lot of them are just trying to do good, right? Um, what I found is that there is something there. There's this kind of beauty to it that you've got to keep going, right? And some of these people are incredibly resilient, right? I spoke to people who'd lost their jobs in the oil industry. I spoke to people who had, devoted their lives to conservation, earning, sort of, yeah, poverty wages because they really believed in it. And these people are kind of what makes the world tick. I also was one of the things that happened during the book was my dad got seriously ill, which was never the plan. So just as I was kind of beginning to get to the point where I was able to resume normal life, my dad was undergoing treatment for cancer, and then that made me think really, really clearly about kind of like generational kind of responsibility and care as well, and the idea of actually like what we have here with climate change is um, horrible, but it's also an opportunity to really rethink our relationships to those who've come before us and those who come after us. So the book finishes with my 2-year-old niece. Actually, she's in literally the final couple of lines is her, and for me that was really important because I wanted to show that there's all these anxieties about what does the future hold for our children, but also there's a lot of hope there as well, and there is the hope of genuine transformation and transformation towards a significantly better world than the one we live in now. I think you have to hold on to that. I want them to take two messages from my book. The first is that uh, writing creatively is an important part of generating knowledge, right? I think there isn't enough credit given to the time and space it takes to create kind of cohesive public stories as a part of what we as sociologists do, right? The second part of it, I think, is more that there's a goodness there and there's a beauty to everyday life which is not always apparent. And from a personal perspective, once you've been through something absolutely terrible, everything else seems less scary, right? So for me, I used to be terrified of climate change, and then a couple of years ago, I woke up one day and I realized I wasn't scared of it anymore. It was something to deal with, and actually that gave me meaning as well. I think it's very easy to feel paralyzed by the overwhelming kind of facts of climate change and increasingly things we're experiencing. But for me, that's also a motivator. And as I was, in hospital, at home, really struggling to kind of live a normal life, I thought, okay, two questions here. What is a life? And once you've answered that question, what does that actually, what do you do with that, right? Life is a gift. And one of the other things that I mentioned in the book is during the pandemic, I lost a very dear friend of mine who was the same age, journalist. And, after that, I was thinking to myself, well, actually, I've been through something horrific, but I'm still here. And within reason, I've got the ability to do these things. So it gave me new sets of responsibility and selflessness as well. And I think that's important, right? I think a lot of academics and other people, they were very obsessed with outputs and uh, getting the right professorial title, all the rest of it, working at British University. That's completely the wrong way to go about it. What you need to do is have a clear sense of purpose of what you're trying to do and do it, because at the end of the day, we're all here for a limited amount of time, and our ability to have a positive impact is based on what we can do in that time. And after that, there's not we pass on to the next generation. And so for me, this book was a really humbling experience. And I think, or I hope, that comes across in the writing, which is that there's a real sense of humility and also responsibility as well. And I've tried to communicate that by writing very personally and very honestly about where I've been and how I come at these things.